Shoeshine by NBR co-editor Hamish McNicol looks this week at mandatory climate change reporting for companies with a market capitalisation of more than 60 million. Something that market watchers and participants say could lead to perhaps less positive unintended consequences. Hamish joins me now. What's the concern here?
The concern has been around for a little while, but it's sort of coming to a head because this regime is kicking in proper. If you're covered by the regime, you're going to have to start sort of reporting or monitoring your emissions from January 1 next year. So, it's just around the corner and everyone's sort of gone, shit. What do we do?
Yeah.
So basically the concern is New Zealand is sort of going first with this stuff, particularly in terms of mandating it, particularly in terms of how many companies are captured by it. And so the concern is we're at the bleeding edge of this sort of legislation. And so it's just another thing that's going to make our local capital markets scene less competitive than overseas competitors. And in an environment where the NZX doesn't exactly get a flurry of IPOs as it is, this narrative around companies in New Zealand choosing the ASX over the NZX has been around for a while. It's not going away. This is just seen as yet another thing that will encourage local companies, particularly the smaller companies, to look at the ASX more than the NZX. This reporting is no mean feat, and I think that's sort of been underestimated by a lot of the market as well. It takes a lot of work. There's not that many people around who can do it properly, so there's a scarce resource. But you're looking at sort of, at least a few $100,000 to get one of these reports done, and then an ongoing cost year on year as well. So it's not immaterial, particularly if you're a company at the smaller end. And that's one of the main concerns, actually, is that basically the threshold has just been set a little bit too wide in the listed market sphere.
Right. Presumably companies' corporate life is going towards this anyhow, and in Australia as well, even if it's not there already. So why not just bring it in anyhow?
Well, it goes back to that sort of bleeding edge and being the first to do it. And if you look at, say, a lot of people compare to the US markets and what the SEC has done over there, which is sort of they're mandating a lot of this stuff, but the Scope 3 emissions, which is the ones that's really hard to measure, valid, but a little bit of a sticking your finger up in the air exercise, measuring your supply chain emissions and things like that. So we're actually gone far enough to say you're going to have to do that as well, which is further than anywhere else. It is the direction of travel. Investors are already putting pressure on companies to do this sort of stuff anyway. But the argument sort of goes, if it's the direction of travel, companies will get there eventually anyway. By mandating it, and particularly by mandating it for these smaller companies where the cost burden is higher than the benefit that you're going to get from it.
So nowhere else in the world does this, not even the EU countries or anything?
No, we are the first, and there was a press release put out April last year by the government, by David Clark and James Shaw, sort of boasting about the fact that we're the first as well. And like I say, these concerns have been around for a little while, but they're coming to a head. The Shareholders Association just last week put out a thing saying we're really worried about the unintended consequences this is going to have for the local market. It could lead to delistings, and sure enough, a few conversations I've been having out and about in the market in the last little while is, that's the main concern here, is people are just going to leave the NZX.
But didn't the Shareholders Association say all companies should be doing it rather than just? Yeah.
So there are different fixes or alternatives proposed. A lot of the some of the submissions to the consultation suggested why not make it the NZX 50. So they have that sort of 300 million market cap, maybe slightly larger. Probably more established companies, they're better prepared to do this sort of thing. The Shareholders Association argument is it should just be all private companies and based on total assets. And it's the same, it's sort of achieving the same sort of goal. The Shareholders Association goal is to sort of just level the playing field and not give you an incentive not to be listed, because if you're the same sort of size as a company that is listed, you're not going to have to do it.
Not everyone agrees that it will have an impact on New Zealand's capital markets. What's the argument against that?
Yeah, so first, I spoke to a few other fund managers as well, and have you heard that there's companies looking to delist because of this? most said no and sort of downplayed it. To be fair, a lot of them, particularly in New Zealand, play at the top end of the market where those companies are doing it anyway. The NZX as well has sort of pushed back and said, I think they provided statistics that more than half of the NZX 50 are doing this already pretty much anyway. And as other people have argued, these regulations are coming internationally. It is going to happen. We're just going to get there. There's nothing wrong with being first. It's a similar argument by the FMA, who have also, in fairness to them, said they're going to take an educative approach to this in the first instance. So there are some pretty big penalties that they can slap on companies who don't comply, but they've said, no, we understand this is going to take a little while to bed in. We're not going to come out and brandish our big old stick straight away. So there's that. And then the XRB themselves, who are charged with sort of creating the standards and things, their argument is sort of, yes, it is a burden, but actually this is good for capital markets because it gets boards, it gets companies thinking about how climate change, which is very real, having a big impact on the world, how that is affecting their companies, and makes them think strategically and a bit more long-term about, you know, if this happens, how are we going to respond, or what do we need to do now to prepare for a future where everything is on fire? So, you know, there's plenty of good reasons to be doing this, and no one sort of debates the merit of it overall. It's just sort of the nuance of how it's being implemented.
It really is the story of New Zealand business, isn't it, though? There's like very progressive companies that are going ahead of what everyone else is doing. The government's kind of rushing to make something mandatory, and then this section of business is saying, no, it's too much cost imposition.
Yeah. But you could argue that that's a reason to make it voluntary as well, as market leaders will go out and do this. You could argue they'll attract capital, they'll attract investment, and then the laggards will see, oh, we're missing out on investment because this is what people want to see. Yeah,
right. So what's next?
So, as I mentioned at the start, basically people are going to have to start monitoring and recording this over the next year from January 1. The first reports are due by April 2024. In fairness to the XRB, in terms of the Scope 3 emissions stuff, they have said everyone can have an extra year to comply with that. And that means that the assurance, the auditing of that is then pushed out another year as well. So there has been a little bit of give, I suppose, in terms of understanding these concerns. But I guess, like with a lot of these things and unintended consequences, you're not really going to know for a couple of years. So it's going to be interesting to watch, particularly, I guess, in a context where markets are down anyway. The NZX is struggling to attract new listings. It's going to be sort of hard to tell what sort of impact this does have, but it'll be interesting to see if a company does come out and say we're delisting because of the compliance costs, for instance. But I'm not sort of totally convinced that we are going to see a flurry of companies leave the NZX, but I guess it's going to be a little bit harder to tell if it puts people off.
And auditors will be very busy, no doubt.
Of course, yeah. The consultants are fine.
Thanks very much, Hamish.
Cool, thanks.